A young woman just starting out in life was brutally murdered. Police turned to her friends for insight and answers, but did they help or did they harm?
I'm Kathy with a K.
And I'm Kathy with a C.
And this is Killer Destinations. Today's destination is Idaho Falls, Idaho. With a population of almost 65,000 residents, the city is the fourth largest in Idaho. Formed in 1865, the city was first named Eagle Rock, but changed in 1891 to Idaho Falls, even though there weren't any actual falls there until a dam for a power plant was built several decades later. In 1951, the Idaho National Engineering Laboratory became the first place in the world to produce usable electricity from nuclear energy. This successful endeavor led to an increase in population as well as prosperity. Idaho Falls is a vibrant city known as the Gateway to Yellowstone, featuring a 2.3-mile scenic river walk. Beneath downtown Idaho Falls, there is a network of old tunnels. And while rumors suggest that they were used during the opium trade, their exact historical use remains a mystery. But in 1996, the police of Idaho Falls had a different kind of mystery to solve. When an 18-year-old was brutally murdered, police turned to those who knew her best. But were they helping or harming the investigation?
On a summer morning in June in 1996, workers at a beauty supply store in downtown Idaho Falls were concerned that one of their co-workers, 18-year-old Angie Dodge, hadn't shown up for work that morning. So two of her co-workers, Julia and Tawny, thought this was weird. They knew that she had recently moved out of her mom's house and they knew she needed money. So they're like, she should have come to work. This is strange. We'll check on her. So after work, Julia and Tawny go to her apartment and they knock on the door and there's no answer. And then they check the door and it's unlocked. So they go in. And they didn't think the fact that it was unlocked was odd because Idaho Falls is such a small community. Everybody knew each other and unlocked doors were not uncommon.
They were probably the norm.
Exactly. So they let themselves in and they walked in and were met with silence. And they kind of looked around and they're like, And they noticed that, there was a little deck just off the kitchen and they saw an ashtray full of cigarette butts and some plastic cups. So they're like, okay, Angie had company. Maybe she had a little too much fun. As they continued walking into her apartment, there was no sign of Angie. But when they opened her bedroom door, that's when they saw her. She was lying on the floor with her head up against the wall next to a mattress that was covered with a bloodstained sheet. And the carpet underneath her was soaked with blood. So Tawny and Julia, of course, are freaking out and they immediately call 911. Police get there really quickly. They check out the apartment, they contain the crime scene, and they specifically notice there was no signs of forced entry. But they know that the door was unlocked for the girl, so they think maybe it was unlocked for the killer. They just didn't know. But there were distinct signs of a struggle. Angie suffered more than a dozen puncture wounds, and there was a large cut across her throat. It appeared to the responding officers that she had been raped and then stabbed to death. So once detectives began their investigation, they quickly came to realize that Angie had been killed sometime between 10:30 p.m. and 11:15 a.m. when Julia and Tawny arrived at her apartment to check on her. And so, Kath, they were able to track the 10:30 p.m. time because she had visited her mother the previous day and she left at about 10:30. So that's how they knew the window. Crime scene techs removed Angie's bedding and clothing for testing and also collected samples from her body.
So, Kath, while crime scene techs were at Angie's apartment, police had the horrific duty of going over to Angie's mom's house and giving her this devastating news. When the police got there, Kath, her mom was despondent that Angie had been killed. She was the youngest of 4 children, the only girl, And she was very outgoing. She was very gregarious. And, her mom was telling police, I'm not surprised she fought because she was often made fun of because by the time she was 16, she was 6 feet tall and she towered over everyone, even most of the boys. And so she, of course, became a strong girl. And she also protected people, whether they were her friends or not, because she knew how it made her feel. So, as I said, she had a close group of friends, she had a fun, gregarious personality, and the Snake River runs directly through the center of town. So, unsurprisingly, in a small town, all the teenagers, young adults need a place to hang out, and the boat docks on the Snake River happened to be where all these kids hung out, as did Angie. And there were a lot of different groups on different boats, not all of them kind of intermingled, but Angie was the social butterfly. She was always hopping from boat to boat, saying hi to friends, chatting with people and whatnot. But all of these people called themselves the River Rats.
I thought the River Rats was reserved for like Havasu.
Only in Arizona, apparently. But the other thing the River Rats were kind of known for is that they were
partiers, probably.
They were partiers. And they just had that malaise or lack of activity that kids sometimes have in their teens where they're like, you know what? I'm going to skip school. I'm going to go smoke weed. I'm going to be a river rat. Rock on, right? I'm paraphrasing all of this. And most of them, Kathy, had actually at one point or another, and I'm guessing it has to do with the weed smoking, gotten into trouble with the law. Because, of course, if teenagers hang out somewhere, police are always going to know where that is, and they're going to go rouse them and, just make sure they know that the cops are watching. But Angie was actually the exception, Kath. She never got into trouble with the law. She wasn't one of the weed smoking kids, and she actually graduated with honors from Idaho Falls High School the year before, and throughout high school, she tutored children in math and English. And Kath, it was funny because some of her friends were interviewed, and they were like, she was the good kid. Most of us did not graduate from high school. Like, she was the exception to the rule, which also has to be hard, too, if you're the studious one, and your friends are all screwing around down by the river, and you're like, I got to go study.
Right, exactly. And she also attended Idaho State University for a minute.
She did, and it was just for a minute. Mm-hmm. So you were talking about the time, Kathy, that they knew when Angie had last been seen. Angie's mom told police that the night Angie died, she'd been at her house until about 10:20, which was 10 minutes away from Angie's apartment. And Mrs. Dodge was so grateful that Angie had shown up at her house that night because she just came over, gave her mom a hug and a kiss. They chatted for a little bit, and when Angie left, her last words to her mom were, I love you. And you know what, Kathy, what's interesting to me about this, and she said she wasn't expecting Angie. A friend of mine lost her brother. Gosh, it's almost been 10 years now. Mm-hmm. He was in a motorcycle accident and killed instantly, but it was on a Sunday night. That day, he had, for whatever reason, gone to a bunch of relatives' houses just to see the cousins and see the nephews and hug his parents, and had gone around and done this, and then he was killed.
Isn't that so interesting?
It is.
Just, it's like you're given this gift of seeing this person for the last time unexpectedly.
Exactly. And obviously he didn't start out that day. And I'm sure Angie didn't go see her mom because they knew that it was going to be the last time. But I know that those are memories that my friend and her family just cherish with everything they have.
Right, right.
So I thought it was really cool that this happened for Mrs. Dodge as well.
No, I totally agree with you. So as we said earlier, Angie had put up a violent struggle, and the medical examiner found lots of skin underneath her fingernails to confirm the fact that she was fighting. And as you mentioned, Kath, she was 6 feet tall. So whoever did this to her had to be strong, even though she was only 18 years old. And so the autopsy found that she'd been stabbed 14 times, but her cause of death was the brutal cut to the side of her neck that severed her carotid artery and her jugular vein. So as you can imagine, Idaho Falls police got the evidence tested as soon as possible, and every piece of forensic evidence from a stranger was identified as having the same DNA. All of it only came from one person. So of course, they immediately go and they're like, cool, we're going to put this in the federal database, we're going to run it through CODIS, and we're going to see what happens.
We're going to find the guy and we're going to be home for dinner.
Exactly, exactly. Well, of course they did, and CODIS had nothing. So investigators went to Angie's family, friends, acquaintances, and of course the River Rats, and basically said, we would like all the males to provide DNA, please. And frankly, a lot of them said, no problem. A lot of them complied, and police collected dozens of samples, which of course reminds us of that case in England where they voluntarily said, hey, please come,
Colin Pitchfork.
Exactly. Colin Pitchfork, and then the other one. There were 2 British cases.
Right, but that was the first one.
Yes.
And that was when he paid somebody to do it for him.
Exactly. Okay, so the River Rats family, friends, acquaintances provided DNA samples, but none were a match. So Angie's murder happened in the summer, and police continued to work, but by winter, there were no arrests, and police did not tell the public that there were any leads. So, of course, Mrs. Dodge, Angie's mom, was quite frustrated and becoming quite vocal about her frustration.
Like only a mama can do.
Exactly. So she told the Idaho Statesman, I wonder what detectives are doing. I don't see any progress in my daughter's murder investigation. What's going on? All this kind of stuff. She really became a force of nature and was like, you know what? I don't know what they're doing, but I'm going to start doing my thing. So she started distributing hundreds of flyers, and she offered a $5,000 reward for any tips. Now, this didn't yield many results, but she was a woman on a mission. So Kath, what she started doing was driving around late at night and into the early morning hours, going to the places where the Skidleys hung out. And she was basically saying, this picture of my daughter, do you have any information about her murder? The whole thing, just questioning people.
And even though this is a small town, that's not safe.
Right. No, it's not safe. But
at all.
Did she care? She
no,
didn't care.
At that point, she didn't.
Yeah, no. And so she was questioning drug dealers. Anyway, so she also, in her anger that there were no leads and it appeared to her that nothing was being done, would also show up at the local police station unannounced, basically going, hey, you know who I am? Tell me exactly what you're doing. I want to know what evidence you have. I want to know what you're doing to find my daughter's killer, this kind of thing. But nothing happened. There was no apparent movement in the immediate 6 months after her daughter's murder.
That all changed in early January of 1997, so this is 7 months after Angie was killed. Police learned that a man from Idaho Falls named Benjamin Hobbs had been arrested in Ely, Nevada. This is about 450 miles south of Idaho Falls. And what interested them the most, Kath, is that he was charged with a sexual assault, specifically raping a woman at knife point. Now, the reason this caught the attention of Idaho Falls detectives was that not only did Ben know Angie, but he was also a member of her funeral procession. So, Kath, in the videos that I saw, they had the casket with the pallbearers on either side. And then as the casket was being wheeled down the aisle up to the altar, there were 4 people behind it who were carrying large bouquets. He was one of the 4. And of course, that speaks to he knows the family. But even though Angie and Ben were both part of the River Rats crew, they weren't known to be close friends. So the detectives were like, did he find himself part of that funeral procession because he was trying to get close to the family, trying to be informed about police actions? They didn't know, but Ben certainly became their number 1 suspect. So Idaho Falls detectives toddled on down to Ely, as we know detectives are wont to do.
They like a good toddle.
They really do, especially when you get to go to Ely. It's right where the national park in Nevada is. There's lots of things you can do. But they toddle on down there and they interview Ben at the Ely Police Department. Obviously, he's in jail on the rape charges. So when Ben met with Idaho Falls detectives, Kath, no matter what they said to him, he was belligerent, is really the best way to say it. And he's like, no, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I didn't do it. Like, he was vehement about it. And one of the detectives was walking behind him. Like, so he was sitting at a table in a chair and the detective was just behind him. But one of the things Ben said was, look, do you have the DNA of the person you think did this? And the detective said, we sure do. And he's like, great, take my DNA. I'm cool with it. It will prove that I didn't do it. And so they did, and he didn't. The DNA was not a match. But by this point, Kath, detectives began to theorize that maybe more than one person was involved in the murder. Because as we said, Angie was a strong young woman. And so detectives believed that it was possible that there would be more than one man there to subdue her. So while detectives knew Ben had not raped Angie because of the DNA, they thought now that he's still likely involved in this somehow. So because they assumed that Ben would bring along somebody who he hung out on the river with, so a fellow river ratter. Is that a word?
I don't know if it's a word, but we get what you mean.
Okay, they're a river ratter. They started bringing these guys in because they're like, okay, if he brought anybody, it's going to be one of these guys. Let's see if we can figure out which of them were part of the attack. So they started with a 20-year-old named Christopher Tapp, who was known to be a close friend of Ben's. He was goofy and fun to be around. People liked him, but he was also a high school dropout. And so he was only able to pick up odd jobs every now and then. He was couch surfing with his friends for a place to stay, and he smoked a lot of weed. Now, Chris Tapp was first interviewed by police just days after they got back from Ely, Nevada, talking to Ben Hobbs. Now, remember, this is just 7 months after Angie's murder. And then, Kath, this is what the detectives did. They knew that one of their officers, not one of the detectives, but one of their officers, who was a school resources officer, knew Chris from school when he used to attend because he, got into trouble every now and then. So they're like, you know what? Let's bring him into the interrogation room. Let's make Chris feel comfortable, see what we can get out of him. And so that's what they did. And sure enough, Chris sees the guy and he's like, hey, I know you. And the guy's like, yeah, let's talk. Let's see what you've been up to. And during this interview, and then several subsequent interviews, Chris denied having any knowledge of the crime. And after finding out their son had been brought in for several interviews, his parents hired an attorney. And the interviews still continued the following week and the week after that. And it was during these subsequent interviews that Chris's story began to change. After saying he had no knowledge of the crime, he now admitted that he'd accompanied Ben Hobbs to Angie's apartment on the night of the murder. Chris said that Ben wanted to go because he was angry because Ben believed Angie had convinced his wife to leave him. Now, Chris said that Ben and Angie started fighting and Ben punched Angie and then stabbed her twice. At one point, though, Chris also implicated a man named Jeremy in the crime. About a week after all of this is going on, Chris then says, you know what? I did stab Angie, but it was just once in the chest. And remember, there were 14 total, but I was not the one who cut her throat and killed her.
So at this point, the prosecutors tell Chris, you need to give us all the information. You need to tell us exactly what happened in a truthful fashion, and we will allow you to plead guilty, but only to aiding and abetting an aggravated battery. And so Chris's attorney's like, this is a good deal. Sign it. Boom, 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 done. Okay. The day after this agreement was signed, DNA tests come back. Now we know that Ben had already been excluded, and now Chris was excluded as well.
Which worked because he said he hadn't raped Angie.
Right. But none of the DNA, no DNA at the crime scene was linked to Chris. So detectives were like, okay, let's get deeper into Jeremy. What's the story? And Chris was like, you know what? It was Jeremy who raped Angie. And Ben was actually the one who killed her. But detectives know, wait a second, Ben's DNA is nowhere to be seen. And they had done a bunch of backdoor work, so they knew that Jeremy had an airtight alibi. So they test Jeremy's DNA. There's no match. They go back to Chris and they go, you know what? The deal's off the table. You lied. The deal was that you had to tell the truth. We caught you in lies. We're done. We are revoking the deal. And Chris was like, well, hold on a second. There's this other guy named Mike, and he actually was the rapist and killer. So they polygraph Chris, and he fails the polygraph. So 1 month after Chris was initially contacted, and this is 8 months after Angie was murdered, 20-year-old Chris Tapp was charged with first-degree murder, rape, and use of a deadly weapon in the commission of a felony, which was a sentencing enhancement. So trial began in May of 1998, and this was almost 2 years after Angie Dodge was murdered. So the defense attorney tried very hard to get Chris's various confessions thrown out, but the judge was like, nay, nay, fair maiden, they're coming in. And that's a direct quote.
I saw that. I'm impressed that you read it.
Exactly. So all of the stuff that Chris says comes in. And this is 23 days of interrogations with Chris. So there was a lot of information that the jury got to see. And they didn't get to see all of it. The prosecution, picked and chose what it wanted to and presented the video to the jury. And the prosecution's case was pretty simple. Innocent people don't confess to crimes they didn't commit. So during the clips, of course, that they were showing, Chris was with 2 detectives, and both of them testified that they had not given Chris any information about what happened to Angie. He He simply volunteered the information and he knew about the case. Therefore, the jury got to see all of this very incriminating video. The defense was very simple. Chris Tapp did not murder Angie Dodge. He had no motive, and there was no physical evidence connecting him to the scene. Chris didn't testify, but the defense did put forth witnesses who provided an alibi for him on this night. Now, here's the thing. Chris said he spent the night with a woman. That's what he had told police. And the date was clear because his girlfriend had caught him the next morning. So obviously the woman wasn't her. And she took the stand and said so. So that's, dramatic testimony. But there was another girl who took the stand who said, you know what? I heard Chris talking about Angie's murder at a party sometime after it happened. And it raised my suspicions. And she explained to the jury why she was suspicious. She thought it was nefarious the way he was speaking. It took the jury a little more than 13 hours to find Chris Tapp guilty of all charges.
And as we all know, before sentencing, not only does the defendant have a right to speak to the judge, but Angie's family and friends were able to do it as well. So Angie's mother actually got up and she pleaded with the judge to give Chris the death penalty, or at a minimum, LWOP. She had said, I lost my daughter. You don't recover from that. Why would he ever be allowed to walk around because he took that away from us? So after Mrs. Dodge spoke, Chris got up. And Kathy, as he was speaking, and I'll tell you what that was in a second, the camera in the courtroom panned to Mrs. Dodge, Angie's mom, and her posture radiated agony. She was leaning forward over her legs. Her elbows were on her knees, and she had her hands around her head like she couldn't bear to hear Chris say a single word. Everything about it radiated the pain that she was going through.
And I am sure that she sat through every day of trial and listened to the testimony and didn't want to hear a thing out of his mouth.
Exactly. She just wanted him gone.
Yeah.
So when Chris got up, he said to the judge just 2 sentences. I am not the monster that everybody thinks I am. Judge, I ask you to spare my life. And Kath, honestly, as soon as Chris was done speaking, Angie's mom got up, walked out the doors. She was not going to sit in there any longer. What I thought was interesting, you see a lot of courtrooms that will have rows upon rows upon rows. This was like 4. You couldn't miss her getting up and walking out.
Right. No, she was making a statement.
She absolutely was.
And also saving herself from blurting out whatever was on her mind.
That might get her in trouble from the judge.
Right.
Yeah. Now, before pronouncing the sentence, the judge said, I think I can say without any equivocation that had Chris not confessed, there would be no conviction in this case. He then sentenced Chris Tapp to life with parole, meaning he'd be eligible to first apply after serving 30 years. Chris Tapp broke down crying and was then taken off to prison. And then, Kathy, all of his appeals were denied. And so, Kathy, Chris now has been sent to prison. Life goes on again. But Mrs. Dodge is still grief-stricken because she knew the detectives hadn't actually solved the crime. They still had someone walking around out there with a DNA match to the person who raped and killed her daughter. Now, Chris might have been an accomplice, but only the DNA is going to tell them who took Angie away from her family. So about 10 years goes by. The detectives have all moved on to other cases, of course, and Mrs. Dodge continues to be frustrated that detectives still hadn't found Angie's killer. So like she did the first time, when Kathy had talked about her going out into the streets and, surveilling drug dealers and whatnot, she took matters into her own hands, and she was determined that she was not going to stop until her daughter's killer was caught. In 2008, this is now 12 years after Angie was killed, Mrs. Dodge requested and then was given Chris Tapp's interrogation videos. And Kathy, it was a total of 60 recorded hours. So she planted herself in front of her TV and watched and rewatched them, making note of everything, because she was convinced that she would notice something that the detectives missed.
And by this time, I'm sure the prosecution and the police don't think anything of it. Like, I thought it was good that they agreed to give it to her, but it's been 12 years since the conviction. All of his appeals have been denied. They're like, okay, here you go, lady.
And Kathy, as she watched and rewatched these videos, she was convinced that she had noticed something that Chris's defense attorney had missed. Chris Tapp really didn't know any details about the crime. And Kath, what she noticed is that each time detectives asked Chris a question about like a key point of the investigation, he answered incorrectly. And then the detectives would give him the correct answer, and Chris would then repeat it. So for instance, the detective said to Chris, "Where did she live?" And Chris said, "I think it was on the corner." And he's like, No, she was in the middle of the block." And he goes, "Okay, she was in the middle of the block." And then, "Which room was she killed in?" And the detective said, "The bedroom, the living room, the kitchen, the hall." And Chris paused and said, "The living room?" And the detective said, "No, she was killed in her bedroom." "Oh, okay, she was killed in her bedroom." Mrs. Dodge sees this happening over and over again, and she realizes that Chris is innocent. And so she turned from the grieving mother into a crusader who was now convinced that Chris Tapp was innocent. But she didn't understand then, why did he confess? So Mrs. Dodge tracked down Chris's appellate attorney, John Thomas, and she gave him the tapes and said, "You need to watch all of these. And by the way, I think Chris is innocent." And Kath, not only did Attorney Thomas see what Mrs. Dodge was talking about, but he also discovered that in addition to these taped interrogations, Chris had been given 5 polygraph tests, and he failed all of them. So Kathy, he was able to get video of the polygraph tests that were administered to Chris. So you couldn't see the person administering the test. You could see Chris, but you could hear, of course, what they were asking. So Kathy, what Attorney Thomas heard was the polygraph examiner saying to Chris, "You need to get these right because I think you're lying. I think everything you're saying is lying, and you have to understand the ramifications of these tests. You could get the gas chamber. So don't mess around. I only want the truth." And so he would ask Chris a question and Chris would answer, and the polygraph examiner would say, "Okay, that right there's a lie. You're just failing this. You're going to head to the gas chamber. You need to start telling the truth." And the attorney was just aghast that this was being done. The polygraph examiner was trying to coerce Chris into giving false information. But Chris was so flipped about everything. Right. That's why he failed.
He started giving false information.
Exactly. And it was all a lie.
So hence the 5 failed polygraph tests.
Exactly.
Do you know if he took these 5 polygraphs when he was represented by counsel?
Yeah, I believe he was, but I never saw anything. The stuff I read about his first attorney, I'm actually wondering if he was a defense attorney or maybe a civil attorney instead.
or maybe just, I don't know.
Some guy out of the yellow pages.
Exactly. Played attorney on TVs.
Right. Exactly. Or, hadn't passed the bar yet.
Yeah, because I had read things like he allowed Chris to visit the crime scene without being there himself. He allowed Chris to be interviewed without being in the room there. I mean, like...
He would watch it as it was happening.
But he wasn't... from a different room.
Right.
Which is unbelievable.
So I wouldn't be surprised if he was represented when he took these, or if it was like the interrogations, the attorney just passed it off and said, "He's fine, I don't need to be there."
I mean, sometimes attorneys do get polygraphs of their own clients, and if they pass the polygraph, they'll give the results to the prosecution. But they don't just let their client go in willy-nilly and take a poly. So the appellate attorney, John Thomas, and Carol Dodge reached out to an expert in wrongful convictions. And his name was Steve Drizin, and he was from the Center on Wrongful Convictions, and he worked at Northwestern University. And he said in an interview, and this was, I believe, an interview by 2020, that it was the first time a victim's mother had called him and said she had real concerns that the man who was convicted of killing her daughter was actually innocent. So Drizin was like, okay, I am going to reach out to the Innocence Project because they're the ones who specialize in this kind of thing. So in 2015, the Bonneville County Prosecutor's Office brought an independent investigator on board to look into Chris Tapp's conviction. And this is the county that Idaho Falls is in. So the prosecutor's office brings somebody in, and it didn't go well for Chris. This investigator basically goes, look, Chris was present when Angie was attacked and stabbed, but, there's doubt as to his confession regarding his personal involvement in her death. But nothing that this investigator uncovered provided clear and convincing evidence that this conviction should be overturned. And it's very difficult to overturn a conviction. Anyway, so the prosecutor's office is like, okay, sorry, Mrs. Dodge, we don't have any basis to overturn this conviction. So Carol Dodge is like, well, she became the crusader.
Right. Watch what I can do.
I know. This lady was a force, and good for her. So she was absolutely adamant that only one person was involved in her daughter's murder, and without a DNA match, they still hadn't found that person. Then, in 2017, a new prosecutor was elected in Bonneville County and looked again at Chris Tapp's case. And during this renewed investigation, one of the witnesses who testified against Chris at trial, and it was the woman who said that Chris had been talking about Angie's murder at a party. Well, she recanted her statement. And so the prosecutor's like, Not long after that, they announced that their office and the defense team had agreed on a deal. They all agreed, and Chris Tapp as well, that the rape conviction was completely vacated. And so he was no longer considered a sex offender, but the murder charge would stay in place. However, if the police ever found the real killer, Chris would be exonerated. So, Kath, with this agreement and rape taken off the table, Chris Tapp was able to leave prison after having served almost 20 years. And this is March of 2017 when he was released, and he walked out of the courtroom a free man. And by his side was Angie's mother holding his hand.
It was such a great sight to see. It was like you could have taken it out of a movie, right? It was just the small town crowd in the best way. And there was no arms held over the head, like victory or anything. It was just, I'm leaving. My defender's here with me. And I get to have a life now.
Right.
And what's interesting, Kathy, is I had read in an article after he was released that everybody was trying to talk him out of this deal. They were like, you're innocent. They'll find the real killer.
Like, don't sign on to this agreement. Stay in jail and stand on principle.
Exactly. And he was like,
excuse me?
Exactly. But he said, this might have been my only chance to actually get out of prison.
Right.
He's like, I didn't know cell phones were a thing. Like, my friends from high school had gotten married. They'd had kids. They had jobs. They'd moved away. Like, my whole world had been tilted on its axis. I've been in prison this whole time. And he's like, I wanted to go home.
It had been 2 decades.
Yeah.
What would make him believe he would find the killer?
Exactly. And it was hard for him, though, because he said, great, I'm not a registered sex offender. I'm still now a convicted murderer. And so he was having a hard time finding a job.
Right.
I do have to think probably having the victim's mom in his corner probably helped.
Sure.
But even then, it's like you got yourself into a sticky situation. What bad things were you doing?
Right.
And so, of course, Kathy, Mrs. Dodge was ecstatic that Chris was now out of prison. But there was still something missing. Her daughter Angie's killer still had never been found. So not only did they want to find the killer, but because they knew Chris didn't do it, they wanted him to have a full exoneration. So Mrs. Dodge and Attorney Thomas kept trying to find the killer. Now, it's been 20 years. All the original investigators for the police department had either retired or moved on to other forces. And so they approached this new group of detectives, and they were all willing to take a fresh look at the crime. But most importantly, if we think about the year now, 2017, genetic genealogy is now a thing. So the detectives and Carol Dodge reached out to CeCe Moore with Parabon Nanolabs. I know any true crime listener knows CeCe Moore and Parabon Nanolabs.
Yeah, she is totally the grand dame of armchair sleuths and people who work with genetic genealogy.
Absolutely, she is.
She's been on a ton of true crime shows and things like that. And Parabon was her company. Not her company, but the company who hired her. Yeah.
Right. So, Kathy, it was the Idaho Falls police who first reached out to her, and she flat out declined it. Because that DNA has been in evidence for 20 years. It wasn't necessarily preserved correctly. If it's been degraded in any way, I will not be able to get an accurate match. So I'm sorry, but that just doesn't work. It's too old. It's been too long. So while the Idaho Falls police couldn't get her to do this, Carol Dodge hoped that she could change CeCe Moore's mind, and she wrote her a letter. This is my daughter. This is what I've done. These are all the things that have happened. Please help us exonerate an innocent man. Please help me put the killer behind bars for killing my daughter. And so CeCe agreed and said, I'm not making any promises because I haven't seen the DNA, but you got to realize this might turn out to be nothing. So CeCe takes the DNA sample that she's been given and she starts putting it into the genetic databases. and was able to use records to build a family tree based on similar genetic markers. There were 6 men in this family tree who were the right age, and they lived in and around Idaho Falls at the time Angie Dodge was murdered. So, surreptitiously, Idaho Falls police go out and they surveil, and they're able to get samples of their DNA for these 6 men. You know, we know how they do it. They look for a cup to be thrown out, a cigarette butt, something like that. And as a result of these DNA tests, all of them were eliminated as the killer. And so, Kathy, one of the things C.C. Moore said was that when she found out that none of these 6 men matched, she was completely devastated. She said, you know, in her mind, she'd let down Angie, she'd let down Angie's mom, the Idaho Falls police, and she said for the first time since she'd started doing this, genetic genealogy had failed her because it should have been one of these 6 men who were all clearly innocent. So a week or so goes by and she's kind of ruminating on it. What can I do? And she's trying to look up other articles, you know, kind of like going back, doing the same deep dive. And so she saw something that the patriarch of this family tree had an early marriage, and she hadn't been able to really find anything about it. She couldn't find any records at the time, hadn't really thought much about it. But now she's going back to it, and she's able to find old wedding records that shows that he, in fact, had married this other woman before he married his second wife. So she's able to get the woman's name with this marriage certificate, and she goes and looks into her, and this woman has already passed away. So she goes to another database. In my mind, it's Find a Grave. We all know that's my favorite. And in there, it says that she had a son and a grandson. And the son would have been within the age range of being able to kill Angie Dodge. So, Kathy, this is now the son who had a totally different name who nobody knew about. And so, Kathy, C.C. Moore, of course, she's excited. She said she was on a plane. She's crying. She's excited. You know, she wants to call Carol Dodge and tell her what she found, you know, all of this. But it was a reason for jubilation-ish, right? They still have to see if any of this matches. So C.C. gives the name to Idaho Falls Police to look up his record in Idaho. The man's name was Brian Drips Sr. And Idaho Falls Police are able to determine that on the night Angie Dodge was killed, Brian Drips lived across the street from her.
Boom.
And he'd been questioned by police early in the investigation. It was like 2 days after Angie was killed because he was a neighbor. They were canvassing the neighborhood and they talked to him and they brought him in for an interview.
And Kath, here's what's crazy. After Angie was murdered, her mom used to go and just sit in front of her apartment and just check things out and think about the daughter she lost and loved so much and look around at the neighbors. And Brian Drips was someone that she specifically told police to look into because he seemed so creepy, which is incredible to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But you know, you sit there long enough and people don't look in parked cars for the most part. You get a rhythm of the neighborhood.
Exactly. You totally get a rhythm of the neighborhood. That's a perfect way of saying it.
So, Kathy, at this point in time, Brian Drips lived in Caldwell, Idaho, which is just west of Boise. So they went over there, again, surveillance, and they were able to get one of his discarded cigarette butts and send it to the Idaho State Lab for testing. Kathy, when the results came back, it was a match. He was brought in for questioning and was arrested on May 15th, 2019 for the murder and rape of Angie Dodge. Kath, it turned out that he was 32 years old when he killed Angie. So in 2021, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to LWOP. And it also came out, Kathy, that he acted alone and told the police that he did not know Chris Tapp. And it makes sense because he would have been 14 plus years older than these river rats.
Right. And 2 months after the DNA test came back, Chris Tapp was formally exonerated and the judge found that he was factually innocent.
I feel like that was really fast and that's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. He was the first person to be exonerated using genetic genealogy.
I wonder how many there's been since then.
Oh, probably tons.
But, you know, we talk so much about the fact that, like, oh, they were found with genetic genealogy.
Right, like convictions. We talk about convictions, but this was the first exoneration.
Right. If you murdered someone, look over your shoulder.
Right.
Not if you didn't murder someone and you're in prison.
Yeah, exactly. This could help you. Okay, so after the exoneration, Chris Tapp started, settling into a new life. He got a job working at a bag making factory. He bought a home. He got married. He saw old friends. But he also participated in lobbying Idaho's governor to sign a bill providing compensation to the wrongly convicted. And in 2021, that bill, in fact, became a law. And so Chris received $1.2 million in compensation, a sum that he said was greatly appreciated and much needed, but in my estimation was way too low.
Agreed.
And Kath, before he received this sum, he had filed a federal lawsuit against the city of Idaho Falls and its police department, basically alleging misconduct. Fortunately, they still had the interrogation tapes, and Chris's attorney essentially was like, look, this is a false confession. It was coerced. Idaho Falls Police Department should have known better. And so should the polygraph examiner who basically threatened him with the death penalty. And ultimately, Chris was awarded $11.7 million.
So he got this in 2022. So this is 5 years after he got out of prison and just a year after he got the $1.2 million from the state of Idaho.
Right. And so you think, he's going to be living happily ever after. But It didn't turn out that way. Just a year after he received this big old fat chunk of money, his wife died in a car crash. She and Chris were in the process of a divorce, and she was driving a Corvette that he'd purchased for her with the settlement money. So that was tragic for him. Despite the fact that they were getting divorced, it was still tragic for him. And then 2 months later, in October of 2023, Chris was in Las Vegas for a car show. According to what was reported at the time, he tripped and fell in his hotel suite and hit his head on the corner of the coffee table. Now, he was found by hotel personnel totally unconscious, and it turns out he fell into a coma and passed away. He was 47 years old. So even though this was originally reported as an accident, he fell and hit his head on a coffee table, a year later, homicide detectives learned that before he lost consciousness and died, he'd been in a fight inside his hotel suite. And within a couple months, 45-year-old Daniel Rodimer, who was a retired professional wrestler and a former congressional candidate in Nevada and Texas, was indicted for the murder of Chris Tapp. So Rodimer right now remains free. He's out on $200,000 bail, but his trial is currently set to begin next month in Las Vegas. So that's June of 2026.
And we'll bring you updates.